Hi, everybody. I'm Stephen Evans, FotoFest Executive Director, and welcome to another of our Creative Conversations Digital. And the program today is in conjunction with our exhibition, In Search of an Index, which is a collaboration with the Texas Biennial and is co-curated by Ryan Dennis, Evan Garza, and FotoFest's own Max Fields. And we hope you'll be able to see the exhibition. It's on view at Silver Street Studios through November 13. And we're very proud of it. So I hope you can see it. Today, we're going to have a great conversation, I think, between a dynamo familiar to Houston audiences, artist and cultural producer Regina Agu, who is one of the artists in the In Place of an Index exhibition, and writer, curator, editor, professor, researcher Nora Khan, who's a fantastic and important figure in digital media today and criticism, curation. So we're very happy about that. And as we get started, I just wanted to thank the In Place of an Index host committee, who are Lee Anthony and Travis Capps, Katie and Michael A. Casey, Ken Frederick, Carola Heron, Anna and Hal Holliday, Marcia and Mike Nichols, and Ann Wilkes Tucker, and as well to thank FotoFest major institutional and individual supporters, which include the Brown Foundation, Inc., Houston Endowment, National Endowment for the Arts, the Texas Commission on the Arts, the City of Houston through the Houston Arts Alliance, the Eleanor and Frank Fried Foundation, the Philip and Edith Leonian Foundation, the Powell Foundation, the Wortham Foundation, the WWW Foundation, and the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, as well as individual supporters Judith and Gamble Baldwin, Wendy Watrous and Frederick Baldwin, Katie and Michael A. Casey, Martha and David Moore, Nina and Michael Zilka, the FotoFest Board of Directors, and in-kind space contributors, Silver Street Studios. We are so proud to have all of your support, and thank you for making this possible. And I know we have limited time today, our daytime program, so we're going to get right into it. And to introduce the panelists, I'd like to bring in Max Fields, FotoFest Associate Curator and Director of Publishing.
Thanks so much, Stephen. And thank you to our audience for joining us. I'm so thrilled that you can join us for today's conversation, which features two incredible guests, Regina Agu and Nora Khan, who will discuss their shared interests and research, which examines the relationships between art, technology, data, surveillance, systemic violence, and vision, among other areas of contemporary political discourse. The guests will use works by Regina Agu that are featured in FotoFest's current exhibition, In Place of an Index, as a springboard for their conversation. As Stephen mentioned, you can see Regina's work alongside the work of 12 other amazing artists living in or from Texas at Silver Street Studios through November 13th. A bit of background on our guests. Regina Agu was born in Houston, Texas. She lives and works in Chicago, Illinois, and her practice is deeply rooted in the Gulf South. Her work has been included in exhibitions, public readings, publications, and performances internationally. Her first solo museum installation, Passage, was presented at the New Orleans Museum of Art in 2019 and 2020. Agu was awarded a Catherine G. McGovern College of Arts and Project Row Houses Fellowship at the University of Houston for her research on Emancipation Park, and a residency at the Joan Mitchell Center in New Orleans through a partnership with For Freedoms. Agu received a 2017 Artedia Houston Award and was a 2016-2017 Open Sessions participant at the Drawing Center in New York City. From 2014 to 2017, Agu was the co-director of Alabama Song, a collaboratively run art space in Third Ward, Houston, which received a 2016 seed grant from the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation. Agu is also the founder of Houston-based WOC Reading Group, and her other collaborative projects include Friends of Angela Davis Park and the Houston-based independent small press Paratex. Nora Khan is an editor, curator, and writer of criticism on digital visual culture and philosophy of emerging technology. Her research focuses on art, music, and literature made with and about software, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. Her practice extends to a wide span of artistic collaborations, producing things like scripts, librettos, and a tiny house. Her short books are Seeing, Naming, Knowing, published by Brooklyn Rail in 2019 on the logic of machine vision, and co-written with Stephen Warwick, Fear Indexing the X-Files, published by Primary Information. Her forthcoming books include The Artificial and the Real, published by Art Metropole, which focuses on simulation and semantic mapping, and a book on the stakes posed by AI art for art criticism through Lund Humphreys. As a curator of Manual Override at the Shed in New York in 2020, Khan worked closely with Sandra Perry, Morrishin Alahari, and Lynn Hirschman-Leeson on new commissions in an exhibition that also featured major works by Simon Fujiwara and Martine Sims. She frequently publishes prose and criticisms and essays for publications like Artforum and Art in America. She is currently editor of both Topical Cream, focusing on supporting GNC and BIPOC critics, and Hollow Magazine, and has been an editor at Rhizome since 2014. From 2018 to 2021, she was a professor at RISD in Digital Plus Media, teaching critical theory and artistic research, experimental writing for artists and designers, and technological criticism. Regina and Nora, if you could join us, we can get the conversation rolling. To the audience, I want to let you know that following their conversation, Regina and Nora will be taking questions from the audience. You can enter your questions directly in the chat if you're watching on Zoom, and if you're streaming this program on YouTube, we'll be taking questions from the comments section located directly below the video. Thank you both so much for joining us. I'm gonna get out of here.
Thanks, Max.
Thank you, Max, and thank you, Stephen. And hi, Regina. How are
Hey,
you?
Nora. Good, Nora. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's really, really lovely to be talking to you about your works tonight, especially since we've spent a lot of this pandemic year together online. We met each other in a writing group at Lewis Place, and every Saturday met with 6 or 7 other artists to talk about dreams and algorithmic logic and abstraction. So tonight feels a little bit like a continuation. So it was just really a pleasure to spend time with the works that you have in this show, and to really get familiar with your poetic scanning generative practice. And in part because we shared, as I learned this year through our conversations, so many shared passions and research interests, but also a kind of focus on one of the driving themes of this exhibition, what Ariel Azoulay calls potential history, and specifically around rethinking imperial violence in the here and now, particularly through the experimental use of tech. So we also share interests in artificial intelligence and tagging and reading and representation and language, and where all of these things intersect. So I'm hoping today that we could talk about each image of yours in this series and the gestures that you undertake. But maybe first, as we flow through some of the overall install shots, which I think Max is going to help with, could you maybe talk a little bit about the driving themes and ideas behind the series?
Absolutely. And again, thank you, Max. Thank you, Stephen. And Nora, I'm so glad we get to have this conversation together. So I think I'm going to start by introducing this work by placing it in the context of my practice overall. So this work brings together several longstanding research interests of mine that reoccur in my practice. For a long time, I've been thinking about the relationships between history, memory, language, the body, and Black landscapes. And one way to think about, one framework that I turn to in contextualizing the various bodies of work that I have and my interdisciplinary approach is looking to Black geographies as theorized by Catherine McKittrick. And so I offer that as an entry point into this work and other works, such as my large scale panoramic series, which people in Houston may be more familiar with, and landscape photography projects that I've worked on, drawings, installations. I'm always, returning through various media. and this new work is a continuation of that research and exploration. I'd also like to draw attention to an influence, a poet that I return to frequently, which is the work of Akilah Oliver. About a decade ago, I was introduced to Oliver's work through other artists, and I really became interested in the way that she approached landscape, visibility, history, memory through her poetic essay, The Visible Unseen. It's a text that about 10 years ago really became really kind of electrified my practice in the way that I thought about all of these different threads. But it's something that I return to over and over again through directly engaging her archive. You're engaging the text itself by hosting reading groups and performative lectures that speak to the text. And so it was actually in scanning Oliver's essay for a reading group several years ago and having an accidental kind of scanner glitch that the work that you're looking at now kind of first began to form. So that was a few years ago. Since then, this work has gone through many different iterations, experimental images, drawings. I've used cameras, scanners, photocopiers, engaged directly with text, staged archival interventions. And these are all ways that I'm continuing to think through not just Oliver's work, but archives as a whole and how I engage with archives of images and texts, specifically those related to, again, Black landscapes, the Black body, language, history, and memory. And so this work has been several years in the making. And it wasn't until last year when I was in the process of moving between New Orleans and Chicago. I'd actually finalized my move to Chicago right at the beginning of 2020, right before the world changed. And so I experienced a lot of things last year in isolation, as we all did, not just being kind of isolated from my professional community, but also, you know, my community of friends, artists, makers, because at the time that everything began to shut down, I was already in Chicago. I experienced the 2020 uprisings. I guess a good way of framing it would be the Black Lives Matter movement, really coming to the forefront of public consciousness. I experienced that here in Chicago, experienced that under curfew, experienced that primarily in isolation. And for the duration of the past year, having a chance to work with you, Nora, at Lewis Place, and to stay in contact with other writers was really a mainstay for me during that time. And so this work began to take on, I'll just say, a new sense of urgency for me. It was a way for continuing to ground myself in my practice, to really think about Black geographies and the tie to Black interiority, and to think about how that's impacting me, but also thinking about the limits of Black representation as a whole. And again, thinking about how gesture can become a way of, a gesture and distortion can become a form of resistance in the archive and through imaging, how text can take on readings through abstraction, how the body can also become, to invite new readings of the body and Black interiority through abstraction. And that's how this work came together in a very general sense. So again, Black geographies, I would look to that as an entry point to understanding various bodies of work. It may look different from some of the larger scale landscape photography projects, panoramas, installations, but I do feel that this is a really important trajectory for me in my work. And I'm really thankful to have some of these images on view.
Amazing. I'd like to come back to this question of gesture and representational limits, and that specifically in relation to McKittrick and Black geographies. But I wonder if we could maybe start with this vast range of technical methods and experimental methods that you have at play here, in which you're moving between an alt text generator and a scanner and text and your own body to kind of bend and stretch technology and have these technologies be in conversation with each other. And so I love that phrase, accidental scanning, as a way that you have used to respond to archives for some time. And then also how you combine text as abstraction, the generative text, which we'll look at in relation to each other with the individual pieces. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about the accidental scanning process, the kind of glitches and artifacts that you describe. You mentioned sonic waves and medical images come to mind with some of these images, the color bands that the scanner accidentally brings up. So could you tell us where the accidental scanning began, maybe the moment of the reveal, and how this kind of manipulation of images over time has created this space of resistance or opacity of potential for you?
Absolutely. Scanners, cameras, alt text generators, photocopiers, spatial technology tools. These are all things that I've experimented with in my practice, not just in my work as an artist, but also in my work as a technical communicator, which is, when I say interdisciplinary, that's part of what I mean. I do feel that my work spans across not just my visual studio practice, but also my community-based practice, my work as a creative writer, and again, as a technical communicator. So I'm always thinking about how these different, modes that my work moves in through the world are in conversation with each other. When I accidentally, just to be transparent through my own clumsiness, bumped the scanner while I was working on generating documents for a reading group that I was hosting in Houston at the time, introducing Akilah Oliver's text. And I really was immediately struck by the potential of that gesture of working with the scanner beam as a way to think through movement, through layering, through gesture, the potential of distortion as a way of opening up the archive, opening up my own work, inviting new entry points and different ways of reading images and text, and the way that those things can interact together. And in this work, I also think that it formalizes that conversation in a way, the conversation between myself as the artist, through my own, so these images are all images of my hands performing gestures. I'm drawing from historical photographs, improvised and spontaneous movement. I'm reperforming gestures from photographs, and we'll get into that in more detail later. But thinking about formalizing a conversation between myself, these different technologies, thinking again about representation and what that means in conversation with these technologies, and also being really interested in the space that the scanner itself opens up. There are, if you go through the image, and we'll go in, again in more detail, but with the scanner beam, the way that it interprets movement as color bands, the way that movement can be expanded and compressed depending on the gesture, the way that multiple movements in time can be flattened or perhaps contained in one still image. And then again, thinking about imaging technologies as a whole in relation to the Black body, thinking about, like you mentioned, medical imaging, or in a much broader sense, thinking about surveillance and the way that artificial intelligence is being deployed in the public sphere and what that means for Black landscapes, Black communities, bodies of color moving through public. And all of those different readings are things that I'm trying to bring into each image. And so the scanner really opens up that space. And when each image is, so after each image is completed, there's another piece to this. So the work is completed once I take the digital output from the scanner and feed it into an alt text generator. And the alt text generator, which is an accessibility tool, it's meant to open up digital space and make it more accessible and legible. And the tool essentially generates a text-based caption. It's essentially what the technology thinks that it's seeing. It's a machine learning tool. You know, we can get into conversations about machine learning, computer vision, but essentially it's drawing from a database of images to generate its best guess as to what it's seeing. And so the title for each one of these works is the unedited output of the alt text generator. I'm really interested in the space that that opens up because again, it's a conversation between myself and the technology, but I'm also really playing around with the limits of what that tool can read at this time. And I'm really interested in producing images of my body that resist legibility from this technology and what that space means. So, yeah.
Yeah, and in that framework of legibility and illegibility, if we're thinking of Black geographies as a framework, the play with illegibility, with invisibility, with opacity, and the limits of representation, well, we can definitely get into the politics of data sets, but I was also zooming out on the entirety of the images, starting to think of your own personal data set of gestures that are illegible that you are also building. And we can look at these a little bit more closely in a second. But I'm curious maybe if you could speak about this range, this archive of gestures that you're producing through your work and exploring here, in which the gestures are a site of resistance to capture, algorithmic capture, photographic capture, and also suggest what you've called a kind of interiority that is beyond capture. Is there a way to describe the range of gestures that we see in these pieces and how you're thinking of the gesture in relation to these questions of visibility and legibility?
Yeah, absolutely. So originally, when I started working on this series, and again, this is going back a few years, so over time, I've accumulated, because I love to research images, I love going through photographic archives. I collect my own, have quite a library and collection of photo books, but I'm also not just what's contained in more formalized archives through books or through libraries, collections and things of that nature, but also really looking at the growing accumulation online of images of, I guess, one area that I'm really interested in particular is a subset of images of, I guess, mass congregation, protest, again, bodies in public, particularly Black bodies in public spaces. And those are images that continue to really catch my interest. And that's something else that I've continued to revisit through my work over the years, going way back to earlier collages and installation experiments that I was doing, almost 10 years ago. And so I'm always looking for different sources and looking at the ways that those images are collected and distributed. And so initially I started out by just returning to these archives and reperforming gestures that I saw in photographs. I'm really interested in the repetition of gestures, thinking about the ways that gestures are repeated over time and perhaps coded meanings or historical meanings, or even the ways that gestures are reinterpreted through reperformance in community. And so I was thinking about those images, and just at first it was just simply reperforming images from photographs and generating, at this point I have over 100 of these images. And so it's something that I continue to work on. And then I began to also incorporate, okay, based on the subset of images, can I improvise movements based on these gestures? And so improvised and spontaneous movement also came into it. And then again, kind of thinking about when a lot of this work was kind of taking the most recent iteration, which again was during, I guess last year, summer of 2020 was a really fruitful time for me with this particular body of work. Again, kind of looking at, since I'm experiencing in a really strange way, this like moment of collective reckoning and uprising, but I'm experiencing that in isolation, away from my community. And so I'm also thinking about the gestures that I'm seeing through the media, through Google Images, through the gestures that people are sharing online, through social media. And so all of that begins to enter the work as well. So the gestures are drawn from a variety of sources. And I like how the 6 images shown here are all pulled from those different sources. And I really love the conversation that these gestures have with each other as they're currently installed.
Fantastic. I think this would actually be a nice moment to transition to look at the gestures carefully. And I'd love to come back to this interplay from what the gesture actually was to how it was manipulated to then how it's read by the alt text generator. And I guess we could start with this first image. And the title of this is A Person's Hand with a Finger Pointed at It. And so I guess I would just say immediately where I began to read the interplay between the image and the text, as a person who thinks about image and text together, like most of us here probably. And so I'm looking at a hand and a blur of a hand, which at first I read without the caption as a hand pressed up against a hand, maybe against glass, which has its own reading. And then when I look at the caption, a finger pointed at it, as though the finger is not connected to the person, which it may or may not be. Everything is sort of thrown up into flux there. You start to then think about the AI-based reading of the images. And so I'm curious about this image and specifically in relation to when you started to play with the alt text generator. And how did the caption start to create a position of either potentiality or flattening for you, or as a way to reread the image?
Absolutely. So just as, to kind of reiterate what I mentioned earlier, when I introduced these, the digital image, the output from the scanner to the alt text generator, what I receive back is a caption that I use as a title. And so I'm not editing the text of the caption in any way. This is exactly as I'm receiving it from the alt text generator. And it is interesting that the alt text generator did interpret this as 2 separate bodies, I suppose, or 2 separate, maybe not 2 separate bodies, but it definitely separated the person from the finger. Like those are 2 like detached sets, I guess, according to this reader. And I think this is a great introductory image because, again, just looking at the formal qualities of this one, the color bands, the distortion, the way that movement is with the scanner beam is being interpreted in the digital output. These are all things that I'm really interested in continuing to explore through this work. And I do think it's, and unlike some of the other images that we'll get into, the alt text generator did correctly identify this as hand and finger, which it does not always do. I think there's something also about the choice of the word person, which doesn't always appear. And so I think this image also kind of, I think it's a good entry point too in thinking about the images that the alt text generator is trained on, and the way, like what that lexicon and what that database must look like. So yeah, the gesture here, it is 2 hands in movement together. But the reading that the generator gives back, I think there's a lot that we can get into with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the second one is where things start to not get a little bit spookier. We have a picture containing blur,
Right.
and maybe we could move to this one. And so I was really, really compelled here about the misrecognition or flattening of the alt text titles in relation to what's a really complex image. So when I read it without the caption, I have a lot of readings of this. I think of like the choreography of movement that is happening here. We've talked in our writing group about ekphrasis and the kind of like loving long prose description we use on difficult images or images that challenge language. So that's the direction I would go on one of our Saturdays. But then when I read it in relation to a picture containing a blur, which is, I found myself struggling to refute the caption, which is in clear contrast to the image. And so this kind of tension arises where how I would describe this image is ekphratic, and then this caption flattens. And so maybe you could speak about the tension between what the captions are seeing and like the artistic work that's going into the image.
Sure. This is a more, I guess, complex image in terms of the bands of repetition. So that's why this, thinking about the gesture itself, it's a repeated movement that's happening. And so there is a lot of, I guess, complexity and distortion in this particular image. I think it is interesting that the alt text generator, I guess, when it cannot recognize something as easily, something that I've noticed is that it does return the word picture a lot as a way, I guess, of like framing something that it maybe cannot read as easily. And then I do think that the blur is something that it's an interesting word choice. And this one is actually a picture containing blur 3. So that caption repeats, it assigns that particular caption to multiple images in my body of work. And so there are times as well, speaking of flattening the images, where the alt text generator will return a caption. And at first I was wondering whether or not to include this in the caption itself, and I decided not to, just because it wasn't always consistent. But sometimes I'll also get an additional tag that says generated with low confidence. So, and the alt text generator is indicating that this is an image that, again, I'm really curious as to the data sets that it's being fed, but it is signaling that the technology does not understand what this image is. Like, it's really signaling that this is like something that doesn't fit into its data set, I suppose.
It makes me think of how many conversations within the AI space, especially in the AI ethics space, which demand a kind of legibility of the data set, or that AI be explainable, or that the public, or that us as the general public, have access to the data sets that machine learning algorithms, as they improve at a terrifying kind of pace, get better and better at. But many have pointed out in the art tech criticism space that for some time, what we will have is this kind of reverse engineering of the logic. And in the next image, the caption of which is a picture containing person, to come back to what is person like and what is the alt text generator seeing as person like, what movements are considered like a person versus a blur versus a finger. Is it in this image? I love the poetic return. Is it the fingers? Is it the cradling palm? Or is it a pattern that's registering for it that is not related to our form of pattern recognition? Like, I put my computer further away and kind of squinted and thought there could be a face-like aspect. So this is where we start to train in algorithmic vision or machine vision. We start to think of what is something that looks at images in terms of patterns and labeled data sets, and not in a way that we have evolved to match text with image or description with image. So I guess this brings us to like one of the core questions in your work, and the biggest question of technological reading, which is the tell of representation, in which you often find with folks of color and folks with dark skin, which you can also think of as part of the history of the photograph as well. So you have a biased data set, and then you have this issue of a biased data set being kind of deployed at scale. So here containing person is interesting in the way that it's teaching us what it sees as personness. And yeah, I'm curious if you could reflect on this caption and also maybe a bit on like how you choreographed between the scans and the captions. Was there ever a moment where you generated a caption, then you went back to the scans, having seen how the caption is reading? But maybe we could start with the person aspect, personness.
Absolutely. So yeah, definitely. I think one of the, echoing that, the fact that this caption returned person. So it is recognizing, again, based on, it could be the data set, like you said, pattern recognition is something that this technology relies really heavily on. And so that idea of recognizing personhood, I think, is a huge one, especially when, so in my work as a technical communicator, I attend conferences. I am part of a group that thinks about AI imaging and ethics, and we have conversations pretty regularly. And again, this technology has the potential to affect kind of like micro, think about it as improvements. If you want to think about the way that the technology is being, like sold or packaged for public, this is going to improve legibility. It's going to improve our ability to communicate with each other through technology. It's going to improve there's all this constant language around improvement and ease and reading as things that we should want, right? Like we're essentially being told that this technology is something that is going to solve problems. And in some cases it does. Again, the alt text generator, increasing legibility in web space is a fantastic goal. It's something that we need as we continue to build out web spaces and as communities and information is, distributed in those ways, more and more frequently, much faster. But again, thinking about what this technology can mean when deployed in the public sphere without consent, and what this technology means because it's based on data sets of images, which means that it's also inheriting photographic bias, particularly when it comes to dark-skinned bodies, Black bodies, bodies of color. There's all sorts of conversations in the tech spaces that I'm in, that I'm part of as a technical communicator, but then also communicating with others in the way that, dark-skinned bodies are misrepresented in these data sets. Like these conversations are happening all the time. What that means in terms of ethics, recognition, like what does it mean if you're misrecognized by AI, especially if it's deployed in public. We're starting to see that's happening already in some cities, and the repercussions of that, like people being arrested for the wrong, misrecognition happening, leading to arrests, leading to detainment. All sorts of things. These stories are already making their way into the media. And, this is the beginning of a new frontier in a way. And so I'm really interested in having a chance to play around in this space while there's still some flexibility and the potential for misreading and misinterpretation, because as a thought experiment, there will come a time when this work may not be possible. When the images are the data sets are that smart, the technology is that trained to where it will immediately recognize what's happening in each one of these images. And but right now there's a lot of space for conversation and hopefully the potential to introduce ethics around this while it's still in earlier days.
Yeah, I get this newsletter about the newest AI. I get a lot of newsletters about AI, but one specifically that constantly updates you on, the newest leap or the new natural language processing generator, and every week, or it feels like every week, there's a huge leap, and the time scale gets shorter and shorter. Things
Absolutely.
that were new, like GPT-3, which was a language model 6 months ago, was, making huge headlines. GPT-4 is almost coming out, making all of these experimenters who were working with AI and ML, already turn to the next and the new. And so I think a lot about this language of improvement and progress being embedded in these tools are almost like a preset. You have to fight against not taking it on, or whenever I hear progress, improvement, the next technological fix, like, my ears prick up. And, actually this next image, which is a picture containing tattoo,
Right.
I think I started to think about this in relation to this notion of progress and improvement. When I was thinking about what are the databases of tattoos, I then started to think about the history of tattooing, both as obfuscation, reveal, and symbolic representation, just the power of it. And then how the database, I imagine, of all of the protest pictures of the last year, all of the CCTV cams and public live feeds that are being installed in cities like LA and Detroit and all over the States, as they learn in leaps and bounds, and we think of this new field of like self-supervised learning, I think of the future captions of your work, and how a picture, another thought experiment building off of yours, I can imagine a future where you might run this and get a picture containing hands blurred, I guess, across a scanning bed, which resembles a tattoo pattern from this place, maybe like medium confidence or high confidence, right? And so as this field of reading images and giving them meaning and captioning them is refined so quickly, how do you think of this moment of ambiguity before total capture? And what are the dangers of that total capture? What will it mean for artistic practice and image making as we're nearing the end here? Some maybe.
Absolutely. So yeah, everything that you just said about total reading, image capture, it's something that I think about a lot because, again, because the way that this technology is framed as progress and, wanting total readings and, language, like context from this technology, that these are things that we should desire. This is something that we should want. This is progress, right? And so I am thinking about the potential for this work. Maybe I'm occupying like a very temporary space or a moment in time where these more, these moments of illegibility and misinterpretation and mistranslation are possible, because in future, like you said, it might not always be that way. The way the technology is developing, it seems like the goal is for these more like total contextual readings to happen. I think the danger of that, one that I can think of in particular, is in relation to any other archive, like who is building this archive? What sorts of context is being introduced? What are the biases inherent in that? Does that mean when, if it's a picture containing tattoo, where instead it becomes like hands and color and glass and, there's more precise language. But again, that's like, where is that reading coming from? And is that the way that, are we going to rely on those types of readings as the way of framing our language and historical understanding of images? Like any other archive, you also have to look at who's controlling that archive, who's gathering it, who's contextualizing it, who's writing about it, where does that language come from? And so I think about that a lot with this work. And I think this ambiguous space is something I really want to play around with now while it's still here.
I think of it also as a kind of poetics of misrecognition when I think of all of the captions being gathered in relation to these images. I wonder if in Azule's idea of unlearning imperialism or think I have the quote here, the effort, quote, to make history impossible and to engage with the world from a non-progressive approach. Maybe we could like look at these last two images too in relation to this. The first is a picture containing a small sitting white table, which I found like a really lovely moment of poetic misrecognition. And then the last image, a picture containing light, which I really, really love, because I was thinking of this as light waves or light on a shimmering surface or refraction. And the scanner's light beam is obviously, moving, allowing for your improvisation and gesture. But also, like you've talked about the way the scanner bounds time. Maybe we could close with a kind of reflection on this practice of non-progressive approaches within progress, whether technocratic or other kinds of narratives of project that are even built within this captioning. So I'm just curious about how you see your practice in the future evolving in relation to these algorithmic readings and the progress that is, fast underway. How do you see your own practice changing in relation to this like increased capture?
Sure. So thinking about my practice, with this work and as a whole, I'm always interested in these areas of, maybe, again, thinking about the relationship between memory and history, like whose history, what histories are we talking about? What memories have been suppressed? What memories have been archived and, contextualized and are now accepted as truth or as history, as the narrative. And I'm always interested in like multiple narratives that maybe for whatever reason have been hidden, suppressed, thinking about the role of language in that and the role of archives in perpetuating certain language and certain readings, certain narratives. And I think that this work opens up another set of tools, another space for me to think about those themes, to research, to generate images, to think about my own relationship as someone who works in image and text in multiple modes and the role that I'm playing within that history. And then also, as this technology gets smarter, then there will be other questions, to visit in future. I think that this work will evolve. Again, it's something that it's a subset of one subset of application of tools and media that I'm interested in. So, image, text, different ways of exploring that relationship. Using alt text generators and scanners is one way of doing that. But there are, again, multiple readings, there are multiple ways into this work. And so, I expect that the work will evolve as the tools evolve. And my engagement with those tools will change as well.
And then we can meet in 2 years and 4 years.
There we go.
6 years and 8 years. And something other than Zoom, but we'll see. I'm sure those tools will evolve as well. Regina, thank you so much. This was really, really lovely. It's so lovely to work through these pieces with you. And
Thank
I
you
think
so much.
now, yeah, you're welcome. I think this is the time for the Q&A, and we're right on time.
Yes, that was an amazing conversation. Thank you so much, both of you, for your time and energy. That was just really illuminating and so wonderful to get such an in-depth view of both of your work, through the lens of Regina's artworks that are featured in the show. To the audience, we are now going to open up the room to our Q&A with our guests. As I mentioned before, you can enter your questions in the chat directly on Zoom. Or if you're watching on YouTube, you can enter a comment and I'll field those questions for our guests. So go ahead and enter those questions now and we'll get that started. But I did have a question just to kick things off about the way in which you view this work. And perhaps, Nora, you can kind of lend some response to this as well in relation to the history of photography and cinema, because when we were developing this project, that was something that you mentioned that was it was incredibly important for you that that this work, despite it being like a not traditionally imaged project, be aligned with that history and that canon. Can you talk about why that's important, and perhaps like for those audience members who are not unfamiliar with the algorithmic bias and things, they might understand that link.
Absolutely. And Nora, feel free to join me in this, but so it is very, thanks, Max. And this is something that came up in our conversations because so these images are made with a scanner. They're not made with a, traditional kind of camera lens sort of setup. So they are camera-less, still photographic images. And one reason it's important for me to think about this, to frame this work in the history of photography and cinema is that, remember this technology relies on machine learning, which is essentially these sorts of tools are, I guess for lack of a better word, fed data sets of images, massive data sets of images in order to train the technology on, essentially giving readings of what it's seeing. And those images themselves are where bias can be introduced. So in some of the, for example, what is a person? There are some really famous examples of this at this point on Google Images very recently where, Black bodies, Black people, Black faces are misread as animals rather than people. So that's like a very overt example of if a technology is only being fed a certain set of images as human or person or, and something breaks that pattern, that's one area that bias can be introduced. And I'm using a very overt example in this case to kind of drive the point home. But so the thing is that those biases in the data sets, particularly data sets of images, also speak directly to the biases of photographic technology in the past. So the way that, for example, picking a pretty overt example, but the way that film is calibrated towards lighter skin tones rather than darker skin tones, the way that image sensors pick up on lighter skin tones and that reflection of light rather than darker skin tones. So some sensor-based technologies, it's more difficult for darker skinned people to use those technologies and tools in public. And so, those biases of images and image making inherited from photography and from cinema, thinking about moving images and video. I really want this work to be, to speak to those histories because I do feel that it is in direct conversation with them. Those historic biases in images and representation are now being reconfigured through new technologies. They're being perpetuated and distributed in new ways. And I think it's important to link the two, to look at them on a continuum of image making.
That was beautifully said. I would just add, Regina, or to what Regina said, and that this conversation helps us understand artificial intelligence and machine learning, which and algorithms, which at first sound, really turn a lot of people off in my long experience with talking about machine vision. It's a way to frame it as very old, and the way of seeing is very old, and the way of ordering the world, knowing the world through visual culture is something that is now being automated and moved at a scale that we can't, or that is harder and harder to capture. So as artists work with AI and artists like Casey Rios or Anna Ridler, who show the potential of actually hand labeling data sets or having more human intervention and interpretation. So you have maybe the prospect of not a future of total capture and perfect description of images, but the potential for poetic description, context, interpretation, narrative, which is, what art does. So I'll leave it at that.
We have another question from W. Foster, who writes, what role do you see the institutions of art and non-art playing in the influence of these spaces today and going forward?
So I briefly touched on this earlier, but there are a lot of spaces right now, and this is kind of becoming a growing part of the conversation within, I guess more siloed tech spaces, but also through artist work, through documentaries, through photography projects, hopefully is entering the public consciousness more and more as time goes on, is that, speaking to what Nora just mentioned, the opportunity for human intervention in these data sets and the way that these technologies are trained, and also really starting to think about artificial intelligence and ethics. What does ethics look like in that space? Not just in the way that these tools are trained and the way that these data sets are compiled, but also in the way that they're deployed, thinking about consent, thinking about image and data capture and the way that it's stored and treated. Do you have any control over your images being used to train data sets? These are the types of questions that I think are hopefully starting to enter the public consciousness and public sphere more. And I think that there's a lot of potential there. But again, as Nora mentioned earlier as well, the technology changes and improves so quickly. It's happening at such a rapid scale that I think, it is going to take a lot of vigilance and a lot of public engagement to really like stake a claim as ethics as being something that needs to be considered in the development process, not after the fact, but really thinking about like, how can this be built into the technology itself in the development cycle, I think would be one way that art and non-art interventions can make a difference.
I would just say very briefly, that was a beautiful answer. And also that there's a long history since, Bell Labs on of artists working with technology companies or in the halls or roaming the halls of them, which is obviously like in a whole field of like new media art and artist as engineer. There's an entire kind of field of experimental programming where artists who are also coders, who are also engineers, are thinking through the ethics of these spaces. I think one thing that art institutions do well and have done really well in the last 5 years is open up a space for a kind of third language, not just bridging between the arts and the humanities and computer science and art goers who may not have like really particularly be interested in this conversation, to like make it imperative and urgent for everyone to be invested in, the process of like machine-based image making, that it's actually what Regina is exploring in her work is something of like ethical import to all of us every day, anyone who has a smartphone or an internet connection. So I think institutions, or art institutions especially, do a really good job of that.
I have a question. This is more specifically to Regina, but I think Nora may have a perspective on it. What role, or how do you see the relationship between performance and improvisation in relationship to history and memory in the generation of these images?
So I think, one reason why I was really in the development of this work, why I started to think about improvisation in terms of gesture and image making, rather than simply relying on the reperformance of historic or documented gestures, because that's something that I still include in the work, but I really wanted to open up the space. I wanted to open up a larger space, because I think improvisation is something that, in thinking about producing the legibility of the images that are produced, improvised movement and gestures is something that complicates the reading by this technology. If you're performing historic gestures or recognizable gestures or movements, that's something that's more easily captured by the data set. But when you're actually like improvising a gesture, perhaps performing a movement, creating an image or something that is not as recognizable, that's where I think like the potential and the space of this, like, you know, project and projects like this, that's where I think the art and like the potential really comes to the forefront. Like that's where I think the richness of this practice really stands out. Like the ability to produce an image of my body in movement that's perhaps not recognizable or not readable is it's a very powerful thing for me as an artist. But I think it also really opens up spaces for where, like, you know, even though this technology is moving, it's developing really fast. And there's a lot of, you know, again, the uses of it in the public sphere are just increasing every day, but that there's still spaces of resistance within the gestures and within the way that they can be read by this tech. And I think that's the exciting place for me as an artist. And I think, you know, I think there's a lot of richness and potential there. Maybe that's the way I'll answer that question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. We have one question from Dorota Basel. Thank you for joining us, Dorota. It's good to see you here. Dorota asks, could you both, Regina and Nora, speak more to your position regarding the vision of a certain technological utopia that presupposes the ability of perfecting the machine vision? Great question.
I can go first, so Regina can have the last word. Highly skeptical of any kind of technological utopia. And I say this as someone who really loves technology and experimentation with technology. The ideologies built within technology that are rooted in an idea of a perfect society, of a technological utopia, of future in which perfect vision or hyper real imagery or more and more accurate images that can distinguish between real and fake as a locus of power, as a source of capitalist power, is something to be very skeptical of. I'll leave it at that.
I completely agree. You know, just very skeptical, but also looking at, trying to think how to say this succinctly. I think I am very skeptical, not just within this technological space, but also thinking about the political implications of like this constant push to more and more and more representation as the solution, as the way that we're going to kind of address systemic inequalities or differences, and I'm just very skeptical of that as time goes on, as a method or maybe as a project. I think the idea, again, thinking about progress, because, you know, anyone who's dealing with, you know, art history, the history of images, American history, you know, we can see, you know, the capitalist notion of like this all-consuming technology that's going to somehow, through making everything legible and everything readable, is going to open up these utopian spaces. And I just, I think history shows that that's not the way it's going to work. This could be a whole other conversation, so I'm really trying to keep it brief, but let's just say I'm highly skeptical. And I think that if you look at the history of images, utopias, but also like, especially when it comes to communities of color or Black communities and what increased representation means, it's not always a positive thing. I'll stop there.
Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Regina. Thank you, Nora. That's all the time we have for today. Let's just go ahead and schedule part 2. No, this was so amazing. I really appreciate you both taking your time to do this. It's been such a pleasure to think with you and alongside you, to get to know your work even better. And yeah, thank you to the audience for your generosity of time and for your thoughts. We really appreciate it. And I'm going to be a little pragmatic here. I do hope you'll join us for our upcoming creative conversations and programs, which include on next Thursday, we have a film screening featuring the work of Tay Butler, Ryan Hawk, and Stephanie Concepcion Ramirez. That's on November 4 at 6. And we have an artist talk featuring Ryan Hawk, who will be in conversation with Dylan Rodriguez, amazing writer who recently published White Reconstruction. If you're into this conversation, you might be into that conversation. A lot of conversation around tattooing. And that's on Saturday, November 6th at 2 p.m. And again, thank you so much, Regina and Nora, for your generosity, for your presence, and for your thoughtfulness.
That was
Thank you.
scintillating. Thank you so much. And Max, thank you. And Brandon Harris, our technical wizard behind the scenes. Thank you to Brandon too. And you've made my day. So thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.